Hey everybody, today we are looking at Daniel chapters 4 to 6. If you've already read these chapters, they're pretty easy chapters to read, and all of them basically contain the same sort of theme, and almost the exact same kind of situation happens in all three of them. In chapters 4, 5, and 6, we have a story of a king who has some kind of problem. In chapters 4 and 5, we have King Nebuchadnezzar, and then we have one of his successors is a guy named Belshazzar, and they have two different problems that they encounter, and those encounters are that Nebuchadnezzar has a dream that he cannot interpret, that's really strange and troubling, and then the second one, Belshazzar, is throwing a party, and this mysterious disembodied hand shows up on a wall and writes a bunch of words, and it's very scary and confusing. Similarly, in chapter 6, the king has a problem, but this time the problem is directly with Daniel. So Daniel's involved in the solution to all of the problems in chapters 4 and 5. So he gets called by Nebuchadnezzar in to interpret this dream. In chapter 5, the same thing happens, that despite all the wise men in the room being present, no one can understand what the meaning of this hand and the words that are written on the wall is, and so Daniel gets called in to interpret. But in chapter 6, it's slightly different. The problem is the king has a problem with Daniel directly, because he gets forced into signing a law that says no one can pray to anyone except the king himself. Daniel refuses to follow this law, and this law is written because Darius who's the king at that time, all his advisors are jealous of Daniel and they want to get rid of him. That's the only way they can think of it, because Daniel's such an upright guy. And so Daniel continues to worship God and pray to his God, and there's this problem where he's run up against the king's own law. The king is forced, which is this ironic thing. He's the great king of the whole of the world at the time, and he can't do anything to go get around his own law that he signed. So he has Daniel thrown into the lion's den, but Daniel is alive and well the next day, and which results in two of the same things that are happening. In chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar sort of comes to this moment of repentance and worship of God. In chapter 5, there's no repentance. And in chapter 6, with Darius, there is, again, this recognition that Daniel's God is the true God and to honor him. And so you have these similar problems. You have a king who encounters some kind of problem. Daniel is part of the solution, so to speak. And then there is either this recognition about who God is or not in chapter 5. And the point of it all is that, again, through all of these stories, the common theme is that despite appearances, God is in control. Despite what it looks like, God is still the one who's ruling and reigning. So, in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar, he's the great god of the great king of the Babylonians. He's the most powerful man in the world at the time. He sees himself as this great tree, and that everyone comes to sit in his shade. And yet he's chopped down and made to act like, given a mind of an animal, and until he can recognize that he's actually not powerful at all, that God is the one who's in control. Despite all his power and riches and influence, he's really nothing when it comes to the power of God. In chapter 5, we have Belshazzar, who throws this elaborate party, kind of mocking God's own people by taking out the instruments that were in the temple, the gold, and using them as common party silverware, and he has this experience happen where this finger writes on the wall that basically says Mene Mene Tekel Parsin, which means numbered, your days are numbered, and your kingdom is going to be given over to someone else. That's the end. Belshazzar, unlike Nebuchadnezzar and Darius in chapters 4 and 6, doesn't have any form of repentance. He rewards Daniel for the interpretation, but he never comes to this recognition that it's God and not him who's in control. And we're told because of that his life is taken that very night. The Persians come in and destroy him and his kingdom. And in chapter 6, we have, again, this recognition that despite the power of this great king, he can't even change his own laws. He's powerless. And yet, God is powerful by delivering Daniel from the mouths of the lions. And the king comes to recognize that God is in control. So that's kind of the overall theme. Why is this important, and why is this in here, and why do we need to know these stories that are, kind of repeated in different ways, in different forms, but it's kind of the same story? Well, you think of the audience then, whether it's directly in kind of Babylon and Persia, or maybe as some scholars say, Daniel was written during the time of the Maccabean revolt, when the Greek kingdom was in charge, and a guy named Antiochus forced the Jews to kind of convert to Greco-Roman ways, set up an idol of Zeus in the temple, and it was a really bad period for Jewish people, and they're struggling and being persecuted. Or you think of it much later. We think of it in different contexts, or even in our own context. What's the point? Well, in all those contexts, it's the same, that no matter what is going on around you, despite the world seeming out of control and the bad guys winning and being in positions of power, at the end of the day, despite appearances, God is still in control. That's what the point of these stories is, to remind us that despite the worst things that can happen to us, being thrown to the lions, for example, or being stuck in exile under a king, a godless king who doesn't care about you or persecutes and humiliates your people, God is still in control. This is valuable. These are valuable promises, not just for the people back then, for us today, that when we find ourselves in really difficult situations, when we feel like the world is spinning out of control, when we're stuck in different situations in life that are just really hard to deal with, we can remember that despite appearances, God is still in control, and we're called to remember these stories and cling to the promise that God is the one who is victorious over all. He is the one who holds all the power in his hand, and he is trustworthy and good, and he will come through for his people in the end. And so I hope as you read these, you can cling to those amazing promises, and maybe you want to live them out and think about them throughout your day today. So that's it. We'll see you next time for the weirder half of Daniel. So we'll see you then. Bye.